Hey squad, welcome back. Now today I'm continuing my mini-series on how you can improve your mixes using a range of methods that I've developed over many years in the music industry. Now if you haven't watched any of my previous episodes on this, make sure you check the links in the description or the cards above. Now today's video is all about reverb, and reverb is a fundamental part of music production. Irrespective of what genre of music you are producing, it's important that you apply reverb to your mixes in the right way, because this particular effect can either make or break your mixes. So I hope you do get value from the video, and if you do, remember to like it, remember to subscribe to the channel, and if you find that my content is worthwhile, why not drop me a super thanks? It will go a long way in supporting the channel and help me to continue to bring you great videos. Anyway, it's that time, so let's get into it. Okay, so in today's world of music production, the majority of us producers who work from small studios will be relying on artificial reverb units, plugins such as we've got on screen right here. Now these reverb plugins range from stock units, as we've got here, the Logic Reverb and Space Designer. Then you've got very complex units like the Reverb from Waves, and emulations of classic reverb units such as the Softube RC48, and another emulation of old school reverb plates, which is definitely worth researching if you don't know about plate reverbs. Now, no matter what digital audio workstation you're working in, you are guaranteed to have at least one stock reverb unit built into that door, because reverbs are so important to music production and mixing. In fact, Logic Pro comes stacked with 4 independent reverb units from which you can choose. So make sure you experiment with the stock units in your DAW, but also remember there are some really excellent third-party units that you can also check out. But before we fully delve into the tutorial, we must establish what reverb actually is, for those of you who aren't completely clear on the subject. Okay, so here are a couple of examples distinguishing the difference between reverb and echo, a topic which I'm frequently having to clarify for my new students. This is echo. This is reverb. Now imagine a small group of people standing in an empty sports hall and they clapped their hands. This is what you're likely to hear. Now let's move that same group of people into a smaller space with lots of soft furnishings like a well-furnished bedroom, and they're going to clap their hands again. This is what you're likely to hear. So essentially, reverb is the way in which sound interacts with the space or environment within which it was generated. And although reverb is most often associated with music, reverb or reverberation is happening all around us at all times. For example, in this image right here, where a lecturer is speaking to a group of people, the sound that is coming from the lecturer is not only going directly to the listeners, the lecturer's voice is also reflecting off different surfaces in the room, such as the walls, the ceiling, the floor, and those reflections then bounce around and eventually arrive at the listener a little bit later than the direct sound, and that's what generates the impression of that elongated tail of sound, which is then referred to as a reverb tail. Now, a lesson on reverb can be quite extensive, and really the point of this video is to show you how you can use reverb in your music. So let's get on with that, and I'll show you how you can apply reverb to your productions to enhance your productions and add dimension. Now, one of the main sounds or instruments that you'd apply reverb to in a mix is a lead vocal, or vocals in general. And one of the key reasons for that is reverb adds an extra level of sweetness to the vocal and adds greater presence to what we're listening to. So let's quickly listen to these vocals right here, and I'll start off with the reverb activated and then bypassed so you can hear the difference.
Can't explain the way I feel, ain't got the words, but there's something about you. Gotta know your name, Won't you tell me? I can't help how I feel inside. One look and I keep on dreaming. Gotta know your name, please tell me. Can't explain the way I feel. Ain't got the words, but there's something about you. Gotta know your name, won't you tell me? I can't help how I feel inside. One look and I keep on dreaming. Gotta know your name, please tell me. Can't explain the way I feel. Ain't got the words, but there's something about you. Gotta know your name, won't you tell me? I can't help how I feel inside. One look and I keep on dreaming. Gotta know your name, please tell me.
Okay, so as you can hear, the reverb adds presence. It also glues things together in the mix, which helps to fill things up and even cause a slightly dreamy sort of sound, especially with a soft vocal. Now, it's very easy to overdo it. So whenever you're applying reverb, you've really got to be careful not to add too much, because you can actually wreck your mix by adding extra overlapping frequencies, which causes mud and therefore makes it far more difficult to mix your track. Okay, so there are a couple of key ways in which you can apply reverb to your vocal track, or for any track in your mix for that matter. Now, the first way is by doing this. Let's duplicate this vocal track. I'm going to call this test and let's color code it. As you can see, we've got a number of plugins on the actual vocal track right here, which you really ought to check out my video on mixing vocals in Logic. If you haven't done so already, check the links in the description, etc. But anyway, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to insert our reverb right at the bottom of the chain there. And we're going to come down to Reverb, Space Designer, Stereo. This being Logic's stock reverb. Now what we're going to do is pull up a vocal reverb. I'm going to go to large spaces. We're going to go to halls and I'm going to go to nice vocal hall. As you can see over here, we've got the wet and dry controls. Let's pull the wet control all the way down. So all we're going to hear is the clean, unprocessed dry signal. As I ease this one up, we'll start to hear a combination of the dry signal as well as the wet signal, or the reverb. So let's solo the vocal and have a little play with this so you can hear what's happening.
Can't explain the way I feel. Ain't got the words, but there's something about you. Gotta know your name, won't you tell me? I can't help how I feel inside. One look and I keep on dreaming. Gotta know your name, please tell me. Can't explain the way I feel. Ain't got the words, but there's something about you. Gotta know your name, won't you tell me? I can't help how I feel inside. One look and I keep on dreaming.
Okay, so that's one way of applying reverb to your actual track. There's another way, which is what I've employed up here on the original vocal track. Instead of inserting the reverb as a plugin onto the vocal track, what I've done is I'm using the bus setup. And if I was to click right here, a new track has appeared, and this is showing me what's on bus 1 on my mixer. If I was to actually go to the mixer, we'll show you that. This right here is a vocal reverb track. And how it works is like this. Imagine my signal comes in from the top of the channel and flows through all of these plugins. It then gets to this point where the main signal continues on through to the master fader, but there's a split right here, and a portion of my vocal signal goes across to this other channel right here. The amount of signal that goes across to this one is determined by this dial right here. Also, let's pull up the reverb that's actually on that track. Let's play back the vocal, and as we turn this dial, we're going to send an amount of reverb across to this channel.
Can't explain the way I feel. Ain't got the words, but there's something about you. Gotta know your name, won't you tell me? I can't help how I feel inside. One look and I keep on dreaming. Gotta know your name, please tell me.
Now, using this approach by placing the reverb on a bus rather than on the actual vocal channel means any track I select, let's go to this track right here. If I set this to bus 1, I can then send whatever is playing on this track also to the same reverb as my vocal, because the reverb is actually on a bus channel rather than directly on the vocal channel. By doing it this way, rather than inserting reverbs on each and every individual vocal track or instrument track, you're setting up a single reverb unit and therefore reduces the strain on your CPU. One thing about reverb units is they are very CPU hungry and therefore can cause your system to grind to a halt if you've got a massive project and you've got lots of reverbs on all of the tracks. Okay, so let's check out some more examples of how reverb might be used with other instruments in your mix. Right here, I've got an instance of Logic's drummer, and I'm just playing the snare and hi-hat parts of the kit. I've muted out the kick drum because I've got that on a separate track, and I'm sending this snare and hi-hat part through to a reverb. The reverb I'm using is Logic's Space Designer, and the preset is the snare chamber, which is under small spaces. Let's have a quick listen to that soloed. Now, that is just about enough reverb I need on this snare and hi-hat part. I don't want the part to be awash with lots of sound wave reflections, just enough to give the impression that this part is being played within a small space. So let's bring in the kick drum and some percussion and a stripped down chord section. Now let's have a listen to the subtlety of the reverb just on this snare and hi-hat part. Did you hear how the reverb helped to fill the space up just enough to add some dimension to the music? So let's explore something else. Now we're also using a different reverb on the piano section. Have a listen to the piano with the reverb and then bypassed.
One look and I keep on dreaming. Gotta know your name.
Okay, now I deliberately brought the track back in so you can hear that in isolation we can hear the change in tone of this piano part when we switch the reverb on and when we bypass. However, when this part is playing within the mix, you're not really hearing this piano part has lots of reverb on it, and that's what you want to aim for. You don't want the reverb that's on your vocals and your instrument necessarily to stand out so that it's obvious there's lots of reverb on there. Now, there are times when you're going to use the reverb in that way for a deliberate effect, but generally speaking, when you're mixing, you want to create a picture of the performance with all of these instruments without it being obvious that there's actually reverb placed on the individual tracks. Now, besides the stock reverb plugins you'll find in your favorite digital audio workstations, software instruments and other plugins will actually host reverbs as part of their makeup. So let me play you back this short guitar solo, which is running through Logic's Amp Designer plugin. Make sure you check out my video on Logic's guitar plugins as well. Have a quick listen. Okay, so you've got additional reverb options on tools such as your Amp Designer and plugins such as that. You should also note that software instrument plugins such as Alchemy have also got built-in reverbs which go towards making up the actual sound of the patch that you're listening to, as we can see right here. So once again, be mindful not to unnecessarily add additional reverb to every instrument or sound in your mix, especially when the sound is already made up with a certain amount of reverb. Like I said, a tutorial on reverbs can be quite extensive, and although we have scratched the surface, there is a ton more that we could have explored in terms of sound design and for creating other types of effects, but we really don't want to let the video run on too long. However, to wrap things up, let me give you some of my key do's and don'ts in terms of best practice when working with reverbs in your mix. Try setting up 2 reverbs on 2 separate buses. One that sounds really good on your snare drum, another that sounds good on your vocal. And as you go through your individual tracks or instruments, you can then determine which reverb works better out of those 2 options. You can definitely insert the reverb onto individual tracks. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, you get a lot more control over how the reverb affects the track that it's inserted onto. But bear in mind, the more instances of reverb plugins you have in your mix, the more strain there will be on your CPU. Now, as I've said multiple times in this video, too much reverb can actually wreck your mix. And my method of determining whether or not I've got too much reverb on is by getting the reverb sounding just right and then taking a bit off. That for me has been a really good rule of thumb. Another thing you really ought to do is once you've applied reverb to your tracks, take a break from listening and then come back to the mix with fresh ears, and that will give you an opportunity to distinguish whether or not you've added too much to the mix. And finally, as you may well have noticed, there's no reverb on my kick drum track nor on my bass track. And that's simply because by adding reverb to low frequency instruments and sounds can really muddy your mix. So keep that in mind when you're deciding how you're going to apply reverb to specific instruments. Now, if I brought you value in this video, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and drop me a super thanks if you feel this video has been worthwhile. And finally, I look forward to catching up with you in the next one. I'm Deuce, I'm out. Peace.